bum. I think this should be good level of volume. Oh, welcome, mi amor. There we go. Okay, now time for the the hyper hexagoner stage, the hardest level in the game. We clear the hard, the harder, the hardest, the hardester, and now we go for the hardest.
Begin. Line. Game over. Begin. Game over.
Wait a second. This is going. Okay, it's going to go. I thought it was lagging very bad for a second, but it's fine.
Game over.
Now that's you, my darling. You're the most perfect. This.
Game over. Begin. Game over. Begin.
No, you and
Game over. Begin. Line. Game over. Begin.
Okay, you win. Just because I live.
Line. Triangle. Square.
That was close.
Pentagon. Game
Oh my god, that was close. That was close. Okay, me too. Have a good sleep. I want you to. Have the shootest of dreams.
Game over.
God, my heart rate actually went up.
Begin. Line. Triangle.
It's a really weird pattern.
Square. Game over.
Ugh, I really didn't want to take the scenic route there.
Line. Triangle. Square. Game over. Begin.
Yeah, I was like 1 pixel away too.
Line. Triangle.
Oh, good.
Pentagon. Excellent. Hexagon.
Let's go. Oh,
Wonderful.
okay. Yeah, I cleared that way way quicker than I thought, but it also lasted way longer than I thought. Ooh, 5 out of 6 sites complete. Only one double left. And the hardest is this. But first we need to clear this one again, but now in arcade mode. I cleared it only in 6 minutes. Wow. Okay. Time for the arcade mode.
Begin. Line. Triangle. Square.
Oh, really?
Wonderful. Begin. Line. Triangle. Square. Excellent. Pentagon.
Why did I take the scenic route again? Why do I do that?
Begin. Line. Triangle. Wonderful. Begin. Game
Oh.
over. Begin. Game over.
Okay, I really
Begin.
need to pay attention to my surroundings.
Game over. Begin. Game over. Begin. Line. Triangle. Game over. Begin.
A little too quick there.
Line. Game over. Begin. Line. over.
Excuse me,
Again.
how's it supposed to survive level?
Game
How's
over.
it supposed to
Again.
survive that?
Line. Triangle. Game over. Again.
I can't take the scenic route because why?
Line. Triangle. Square. Excellent.
God, I hate this pattern. Ugh,
Again.
that was so close. Oh my god.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Triangle. Square. Hexagon. Excellent. Hexagon.
Nice. It's insane how sometimes I can like, last 80 to 100 seconds, and sometimes I cannot even last like 5 seconds. I love RNG-based games. But now, only one level left to try in the game. The hardest test stage. I don't think I'm gonna be able to do it today, but I want to take a little peek to what I'm going up against.
Again. Game
missed the
over.
song.
Again. Excellent. Game over.
Oh, God.
Again. Excellent. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over.
That
Again.
pattern is literally the debit.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
I think I'm gonna have to watch a video or something because I don't know how to deal with that pattern.
Excellent. Line. Game over. Again. Game over.
I'd say
Again.
I really miss the song though.
Game over. Again. Game over.
Remember the Hexagon stage took me way longer than the first two. And I think this might be the case again.
Line. Game over.
What am I
Again.
supposed to do there? I don't know.
Game over.
Too
Again.
much sauce in that one.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
It's not the strut.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
It's only that pattern that's giving me trouble.
Game over. Again.
Maybe left and right.
Game over.
Okay, we'll go
Again.
right.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Excellent. Game over. Again.
I still don't understand.
Game over.
Yeah, I think I'm just
Again.
gonna have to trial and error it. Like find out what the heck it
Game
wants from
over.
me.
Again. Game over. 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 Again. Line. Excellent. Game over.
Yeah, that pattern is also kind of tricky.
Again. Game over. Again. Game over.
Oh my god, I went the wrong way again.
Again. Line. Game over.
Oops.
Again. Game over. Again. Game over.
Why did I
Again.
keep going the wrong way in that one?
Line. Game
Oops.
over.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna keep playing until I get to like 30
Again.
seconds.
Game over.
My god, this old heart.
Again. Line. Game over. Again.
What was that pattern?
Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Game over. Again. Over.
I think that's it. I think I just need to go zigzagging. Like, not zigzagging, like left and right.
Game over.
But then it won't work. There.
Again. Game over.
Hey, I don't understand what this game wants from me. What the hell am I supposed to do?
Again. Line. Excellent. Game over.
Yeah, never mind. It is as hard, even harder than I thought.
Again.
I cannot even get to 20 seconds now.
Line. Game over.
As
Again.
soon as I learn how to deal with that pattern, I'm gonna be unstoppable.
Game over. Again.
Kind of unstoppable.
Game over.
Just a
Again.
little bit unstoppable.
Game over.
Okay, maybe not that unstoppable.
Again. Game over. Again. Line. Excellent. Triangle. Game over.
Ouchie! Triangle.
Again.
I even need to follow my instinct. I don't know why I did that.
Game
Nope.
over. Again. Game over.
Okay, go.
Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
Oops.
Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Game over. Again.
Me no comprehend.
Line. Game over. Again.
I think it's like 2 to the left and then 2 to the right.
Game
Or something
over.
like that.
Again. Game over. Again. over again. Line. Game over again. Game over. Again. Game over again. Game over again.
Almost.
Game over.
Okay, change of plans. Once I get past that pattern, I'm gonna
Game
be done with
over
the stream,
again.
because my god. The pattern is so
Game
annoying.
over again. Line. Game over again. Game over again. Game over again. Line. Game over again. Line. Game over. Again. Line. Game over.
Oh, okay.
Again.
It's like do a full circle, almost a full circle, and then stop, and then going back to circling again.
Game over. Again.
God damn, how do I do that?
Game over again. 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 Line. Game over. Again. Game over again.
I just know that if I
Game
get that
over
stupid pattern,
again.
I'm absolutely cooked.
Game over again.
I'm gonna be absolutely grilled.
Game over again. Game over again. Line. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Line. Game over again. Game over again. over again. Game over
Really?
again. Game over again. Game over again. Game over
God, I'm
again.
really bad at this. Not even like counting the stupid
over
pattern.
again. Game over again. Game
Once
over
I
again.
really get a hold of the speed of the arrow thing.
Game
Ouch.
over again. Game over
Oh, get hold of it.
again.
Let me just take a break with this one.
Line. Triangle. Square. Pentagon. Hexagon. Game
Oh,
over.
really? I died literally the second Hexagon started? Okay.
Again. Game over again.
Oh, it's hilarious how I can last more time in the hyper
again.
Hexagoner state than the free Hexagon stage.
Game over again. Game over again.
Oh, look, I was kind of cooking.
Game over again. Line. Game over again. Game over again. Game over again. Game over again. Game over again.
Then why is this so difficult?
Game over again. 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 Line. Game over
Oh, I was so close.
again. Game over 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 again. Game over. Again. Line. Game over. Again. Line. Game over. Again. 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 Line. Game over. Again.
It's gonna drive
Game
me
over.
insane.
Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
Almost.
Game over. Again. 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 Line. Game over. Again. 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 Game over. Again.
I was about to go out to the left.
Line. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again. Game over. Again.
I really do. See where exactly I need to stop.
Game
Oh,
over. Again. Game
oh,
over.
I was kinda.
Again.
I need to do like that, and then stop at the right moment, and then continue.
Game over. Again.
I really feel like I need to watch a video.
Game
Ouch.
over. Again. Game over.
I think, okay, 40 minutes. Yeah, okay, I'll take 3 more attempts, and then I'm good to go. for
Game
today.
over.
Okay, after this one.
Again. Game over. Begin. Game over.
Okay, last try for the day.
Yeah.
Hopefully I will make it far.
Game over.
Okay, one more.
Begin. Line. Crying. Game
Oh,
over.
okay, I made it far. Okay, everyone, that's gonna be all for today. Thank you everybody so much for watching. I think I'm gonna have to practice off camera this level a lot because I don't want to spend like 4 hours on this level like it did on the Hexagon stage on the stream. Anyway, take care and I'll see you all next time. Bye. Bye.